I never thought a job that paid barely enough to cover rent would lead me to something that would shake me to my core. I was just a caregiver. Invisible. Forgettable. One of those women who scrub toilets, spoon-feed strangers, change adult diapers, and whisper, "You're safe," to people who don't even remember their own names. My name is Clara. I'm 46 years old, Brazilian. And for the past 7 years, I've lived in the shadows of other people's families, trying to give dignity to the ones they left behind. My days started before the sun. I'd leave my apartment just after 5:30 in the morning, walking through the biting cold of North Carolina winters with gloves that had a hole in the thumb. The bus always smelled like wet seats and regret, the kind of silence that only exhausted workers carry. I'd get to the facility at 6:15, clock in, tie my curls into a tight bun, and change into that stiff blue uniform that never quite fit right. It always smelled faintly of bleach, no matter how many times I washed it. The corridors were long, with overhead lights that buzzed like dying insects. Each room held a life paused in slow motion. People who once danced, laughed, yelled, built things, broke things, made love, made mistakes. Now they just waited. Some in silence, some crying, some calling out for mothers who died 30 years ago. And in that place, I became something in between. Not quite nurse, not quite maid. A quiet witness to the final chapters of forgotten lives. I learned to recognize the sighs of pain before they turned into screams. I learned the difference between the smell of infection and the smell of fear. I could tell when someone was close to dying by the color in their fingertips. Most days I worked through lunch. No one noticed. That was the thing about being a caregiver. You give, and when there's nothing left to give, you find a way to give more. Because if you stop, who will care? The facility wasn't the worst, but it wasn't a place of joy either. It had that hollow smell, a mix of disinfectant, old sheets, and bodies slowly giving up. The nurses did what they could, but they were overworked. The administrators smiled during inspections and turned their backs the rest of the year. Families came on holidays, brought balloons and cookies, took selfies for Facebook, then disappeared again. And the patients? They stayed. In silence, in confusion, in diapers that weren't always changed in time. I remember one woman, Mrs. Fields, 91 years old, former school principal, sharp as a knife until dementia stole her sentences. One afternoon, I found her crying under her blanket. When I asked what was wrong, she whispered, "I don't know where I left my students." She thought she was still in her classroom, still responsible, still needed. That broke something in me, because I realized that even after the world forgets you, your heart keeps trying to serve someone. That's the part they don't tell you when you sign up for this job. It's not just physical labor. It's emotional excavation. You dig through layers of memory, trauma, longing. You become the keeper of stories no one else has time to hear. I've heard confessions whispered between spoonfuls of soup. I've watched men beg forgiveness from wives they mistook me for. I've held hands that trembled not from age, but from memories they couldn't speak out loud. And yet, I stayed, because in all that silence, in all that decay, there was something sacred, something most people miss, the chance to be the last witness, the final heartbeat of a life that mattered once, that matters still. But I won't lie. There were nights I came home and cried into a bowl of rice and beans. Nights I questioned everything. My worth. My purpose. If anything I was doing actually made a difference. Some of these patients forgot my name 5 minutes after I told them. Some called me by their daughter's name, or by the name of a maid they had when they were children. Once, a man called me dog. Not even in anger. Just habit. Like I wasn't human. I wanted to scream. But instead, I adjusted his pillow and said, "Would you like some water, sir?" Because that's the job. You swallow your pride for someone else's peace. It was on one of those quiet mornings when the sky outside was still the color of ash that everything changed. I clocked in, grabbed the linen cart, and headed toward the east wing. The rooms were all the same. Beige walls, a single bed, a television no one watched, a window facing nothing. But that morning, I was assigned to room 112, a room I hadn't entered before. A patient I hadn't cared for yet. Just a name on the schedule. Mr. Howard Livingston. And something about that name made the hairs on my neck stand up. Room 112 had a silence that felt different. Not the kind of quiet you get used to in nursing homes. The kind filled with machines beeping, slow breathing, and the occasional moan from down the hall. No. This was the kind of silence that felt like it had been chosen. Built. Guarded. Like the air itself had learned not to make a sound out of respect. Or fear. The name on the clipboard was Howard Livingston. 84 years old. Male. No known allergies. No emergency contacts. Under diagnoses, there was a short list of medical terms. Heart failure. Osteoarthritis. Early-stage dementia. But none of that stood out. What did stand out was the absence of notes where there should have been pages. No history. No family updates. No behavioral notes. Just blank space. That's rare. Almost everyone has someone. A daughter who checks in, a niece who sends flowers, a neighbor who complains. But this man? Nothing. When I knocked on the door and stepped inside, the air felt colder than the rest of the hallway. Not because the temperature was different, but because the energy was. The blinds were pulled tight, letting in only a sliver of pale light that sliced across the floor. The bed was made, perfectly tight. And there he was, lying still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling like it was telling him a secret he didn't want to hear again. Mr. Livingston didn't move when I entered. He didn't flinch or acknowledge me. His hands were folded over his chest like he was already preparing for something final. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and the veins on his hands stood out like blue rivers on a map. I approached slowly, announcing myself as I always did, even if the patient seemed unresponsive. "Good morning, Mr. Livingston. I'm Clara. I'll be helping you today." Nothing. No blink. No turn of the head. Just breathing. Shallow, slow, measured. I checked his vitals, making as little noise as possible. The machines were steady, heartbeat consistent, oxygen levels normal. Physically, he was alive. But spiritually, I couldn't tell. As I began to adjust his bedding, my eyes kept returning to his face. There was something haunting about it. Not just because of age or illness, but because it looked like he'd been waiting. Not for help, not for comfort, for judgment. His eyes, pale and faded, had a stillness that only comes when someone has seen too much, or lost everything worth seeing. I tried again. "Would you like some water, sir?" No response. Not even a twitch. I gently raised the bed to help with circulation, as we always did during morning rounds. His gaze remained fixed on the ceiling. That's when I noticed the photo on the nightstand. It was old, black and white, faded at the edges. A woman in her 30s, smiling wide, holding a little girl with curly hair and dimples. They stood in front of a white picket fence, the kind that used to be in magazines. On the back, in shaky pen, "Elaine and Meredith, summer of 1965. The handwriting was beautiful, careful, the kind of handwriting people used when letters still meant something. I picked up the photo gently. "Is this your family, Mr. Livingston?" I asked, not expecting an answer. His eyes didn't move, but something in the room shifted. Not visibly, not even audibly, but inside me. Like the air had changed density. I set the photo back exactly where I found it. I didn't want to intrude, but I also couldn't ignore the feeling that this room was a shell around a man with stories buried so deep, he no longer knew how to tell them. Or worse, no longer believed anyone would care. As the shift went on, I asked one of the nurses about him. "Howard," she said, almost surprised. "He barely speaks, doesn't eat much, doesn't cause trouble, keeps to himself. No visitors since he arrived. I think it's been years." I pressed. "Do we know anything about his past?" She shrugged. "Came from another facility. We only got the basics. Said he didn't want to be disturbed. Asked for the blinds to be kept closed and his meals to be left on the tray cart. Some of the night staff say he talks in his sleep, but it's not words they recognize. Sometimes it's just numbers, sometimes names. Numbers, names. That stayed with me. The next morning, I brought his breakfast in person instead of leaving it outside. I knocked, entered, spoke softly. "I brought your oatmeal and tea, Mr. Livingston. It's still warm." I placed it on the tray next to him. He didn't move, but I swear, I saw the corner of his lip tighten, just slightly. I began changing the linens on the empty bed next to his. The facility kept 2 beds in most rooms, even if only one was used. As I pulled the fitted sheet, I glanced over. His eyes were no longer on the ceiling. They were on me, watching, not with judgment, not with curiosity, just presence. And that was more than I'd seen from him until now. "You've been here a while," I said softly, not expecting a reply. "I hope the tea is good. It's ginger and chamomile today." His eyes didn't blink, but I saw his fingers twitch. A subtle movement. A small thing. But in a world where stillness had been his language, it meant something. I didn't push. I just worked. Cleaned, tucked, refilled the water pitcher. And before I left, I looked at him one last time. "If you ever need anything," I said gently, "even if it's just someone to sit with, I'm here." That was all. No miracles, no sudden breakthroughs. But as I walked out, I felt his eyes following me to the door. Not in suspicion, not in fear, but in recognition. From that moment on, I made a habit of visiting room 112 a little longer each day. His silence was no longer empty. It was full of something. Stories, secrets, shadows. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel it. Like a pressure under the surface of calm water. Something was there, waiting, watching, deciding if I was the right person to trust. And I was about to learn just how much weight silence can hold. Fridays always felt different. Not because the schedule changed or the routines became easier. If anything, the end of the week brought more fatigue, more shortcuts, more silent corners where mistakes hid. But emotionally, there was something about Fridays that made the walls feel heavier. Patients grew quieter. Staff moved faster. The weight of an entire week settled in the bones. That morning, I arrived before sunrise as usual. The air outside was thick with humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your back before you even clocked in. I moved through the facility like I always did, nodding to the overnight nurse who looked like she hadn't blinked since 2 a.m. She handed me the updated care log. "Routine," she said without looking up. "Except 112 needs a full bed change. He had a rough night." Room 112. Mr. Livingston. I made my way there, linen cart squeaking at every turn. The hallway was quiet, echoing with the soft murmur of a TV left on somewhere in the distance. As I approached his door, I felt that familiar stillness again. The way the air around his room always seemed to pull inward, like the gravity was stronger there. He was lying in bed, as usual, eyes open, staring blankly ahead. The room was dim, blinds still drawn. I greeted him softly. "Good morning, Mr. Livingston. I'm just going to freshen things up in here today." He didn't respond, but I no longer expected him to. I started with the routine. Remove the used linens, disinfect the railings, fluff the pillows. I moved with practiced hands, quiet steps, careful not to disturb him even though he never flinched. As I pulled back the sheets, I noticed something strange. One of the mattress corners was stitched. Sloppily, not professionally done. A crude zigzag of beige thread, like someone had quickly closed a wound and hoped no one would look too closely. That wasn't standard. Not on our beds. Curiosity nudged me gently at first, then harder. I double-checked the sheet. No tags missing. No manufacturer notes explaining the stitching. I reached down, ran my fingers along the seam. It was rough, tight, recent. My pulse quickened, a tiny drumbeat under my skin. I glanced over at Mr. Livingston, still staring, still unmoving, but I felt his awareness, like he knew exactly what I was touching, like he'd been waiting for someone to notice. I hesitated, then quietly retrieved a pair of small scissors from the cart drawer. I slid the blade gently under the first stitch and snipped. One by one, the threads came undone. And then I saw it, tucked between the mattress foam and the metal frame, a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, fragile, as if time itself had tried to erase it. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. It wasn't sealed, just folded. No name, no date, No indication of who it was meant for. I looked again at Mr. Livingston. His eyes had moved, just slightly. Now they were on me. I opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the brittle paper inside. The handwriting was jagged, unsteady, like someone had written it during a storm. If someone finds this, it means I still have a chance. Please, don't let me die with this on my conscience. I stopped breathing. The words hit like a slap. Not a cry for help, not a goodbye, a plea, a confession, or something worse. Below the opening line, the ink had faded in places, but I could still make out the rest. In 1963, I made a choice, one that ended lives, one that haunts me every time I close my eyes. No one knows. No one ever asked. I buried the truth, just like they told me to, but it didn't stay buried. Not in my mind, not in my chest. If anyone finds this, I beg you, look further. Someone needs to know. Even if I don't deserve forgiveness, the truth deserves air. I sat there, holding the paper like it was a live wire. The room seemed to shrink. The walls pulsed. I felt dizzy. I'd heard confessions before, quiet admissions whispered in the final days of life. But this wasn't about guilt from a failed marriage or regret over a lost child. This was something darker, more deliberate. My first instinct was to put the letter back, pretend I hadn't seen it, protect myself from the consequences of curiosity. But I couldn't. Something about that handwriting, that urgency in the trembling loops of each letter, told me this wasn't fiction. This wasn't the rambling of an old mind gone soft. It was a map, a final breadcrumb. I folded the letter and slipped it into my scrub pocket. Not out of theft, but out of instinct. Something told me it wouldn't be safe staying in that room. I continued changing the bedding, though my hands shook. As I lifted the mattress to tuck in the clean sheet, I scanned the rest of it. No other openings, no more clues, just that one spot, that one message. When I was done, I turned to Mr. Livingston. He was still watching me. I found it, I said quietly. I read it. His lips didn't move, but his eyes softened, just a fraction, enough for me to see that there was still a man inside, not just a body waiting to be washed and fed. A man who had held something for too long, alone. I didn't know what to do. My training didn't cover this. The handbook tells you how to clean wounds, administer medications, and de-escalate combative behavior. It doesn't tell you what to do when a patient begs for redemption in a language made of secrets. I left the room, unsure of what I had just walked into. My feet felt heavier, my chest tighter. I went to the break room, sat at the far end of the table with the letter still burning a hole in my pocket. The other caregivers were laughing about something. A spill in room 204, a mispronounced medication name. I couldn't hear them. I couldn't speak. I just kept rereading the words in my head. The date, the word lives, the line that said someone needed to know. Later that day, I went back into the room during the evening rounds. I didn't say much, just adjusted his pillow, offered water, checked his vitals. As I turned to leave, I paused at the doorway. I looked back at him. "You did the right thing hiding it," I said softly. "But someone has it now, and I'm listening." He blinked. Once. It was the first time I saw him move. The letter stayed with me like a whisper in the back of my mind, even when I tried to silence it. I kept it folded neatly inside my wallet, tucked between old receipts and a photo of my mother I hadn't looked at in months. But the words burned through everything else. I made a choice, one that ended lives. Every time I read that line, I felt my chest tighten. I didn't know what he had done or who had suffered because of it, but I knew one thing for certain. Howard Livingston was not just another quiet old man waiting to die. He was someone trying desperately to leave behind more than a name on a death certificate. In the following days, I watched him closer. I studied his silence like it was a foreign language. The way his eyes hovered in corners. The way his fingers twitched slightly during sleep, as if counting something. His meals remained mostly untouched. He still didn't speak, but I could feel something had changed. His presence had weight now, like a book you hadn't opened but knew held something dangerous. I started looking into small details. His clothes, always plain, button-ups with frayed cuffs, slippers that looked almost new. His side table had no medications, no books, no hobbies. Just the one photo of the woman and the child. Elaine and Meredith, summer of 1965. The girl looked about 6. The woman, maybe late 30s, had the kind of smile you only see when someone feels truly loved. It was an old photo, but it didn't feel distant. It felt like a wound that hadn't closed. One night after my shift, I sat in my apartment with the letter in my lap and my laptop open. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe something about 1963, about military records, scandals. I typed in the name Howard Livingston along with the year. There were dozens of results. Obituaries, men who weren't him, articles that led nowhere. But one entry stopped me. It was a newspaper clipping from 1964, a headline from a now-defunct local paper in Virginia. Decorated officer returns home after classified mission overseas. The article mentioned a Howard M. Livingston, Army intelligence, no further details. The photo was grainy, but it was him, younger, broad shoulders, cold eyes, standing next to a general, shaking hands, smiling stiffly. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. This man had been in intelligence, which meant his silence wasn't just grief. It was trained, conditioned. He had built a vault around whatever he was hiding, and he had carried it for decades. Alone. I read the letter again. There was fire, screaming. They told me it was for the good of the country, but when I looked down at the bodies, children, I knew. That wasn't defense. That was silence, disguised as patriotism. I signed the report. I agreed to forget, but I never did. My hands shook. I had read it a dozen times already, but now, with that article on my screen, the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't the confession of a guilty old man losing his grip on reality. This was a record, a legacy, an attempt to rewrite the ending of a story buried under government stamps and polite lies. I began noticing how differently I moved around him. My voice softened. My steps slowed. I didn't treat him like a fragile man. I treated him like a survivor. Of what, I wasn't entirely sure. But I knew it wasn't just war. It was the kind of survival that leaves something inside you frozen. During one of my evening checks, I stayed longer than usual. The lights were low. He was awake, but as always, silent. I stood beside him for a moment, unsure what to say. "You wrote it down," I said finally. "You wanted someone to find it." His eyes didn't move, but I saw his chest rise deeper than before. A long breath. "I did find it. I read every word. I don't know everything, but I know you didn't want to die with it still inside you." Another breath. Slow. Heavy. "I don't know what to do with it," I admitted. "I'm not a judge. I'm not anyone important. I just change sheets and bring tea." Still, no response. But something inside the silence felt warmer. "There were children?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes shifted, just slightly. Not to me, but to the ceiling. Then back. Then, for the first time, I saw him blink. Once. Deliberately. Yes, it was the smallest thing, but it felt like an earthquake. He had answered. After days of stillness, after years of silence. I sat down in the chair next to his bed. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I just let the room hold whatever had just passed between us. When I finally spoke, my voice was softer. "Did anyone else survive?" His eyes closed. Not in sleep. In pain. I waited. Eventually, he opened them again. And this time, when he looked at me, it wasn't just presence. It was pleading. I nodded. "I'll listen. When you're ready." That night, I dreamt of a burning village. Screams echoed between walls that crumbled like paper. A man stood in the middle, wearing a uniform stained with ash. His face was blank, but his hands were shaking. When I woke, I didn't feel rested. I felt marked. At the facility, Mr. Livingston was asleep when I arrived. But there was something on the nightstand that hadn't been there before. Another envelope. Thicker this time. Untitled. I picked it up, carefully, and opened it. Inside were pages. 4, maybe 5, handwritten. The ink darker, more recent. It wasn't a confession. It was a memory. An account. Names of places I didn't recognize. coordinates, a list of names, some crossed out, and one phrase written twice at the bottom of the last page. Don't let them say it never happened. The room spun slightly as I read. These were the words of a man who had carried ghosts in his throat for 60 years, who had buried more than secrets, who had tried, in his own way, to make sure that someone, someday, would know. I looked at him, sleeping, breathing slow, peaceful, and I realized then, this wasn't just about history. It was about dignity, about restoring a humanity he had once helped destroy, and then spent a lifetime trying to earn back. I folded the pages slowly, carefully, and I placed them back in the envelope. The truth was no longer buried. It was awake, and it was mine to carry now. The weight of the envelope pressed against my chest, even when it wasn't physically there. Every time I moved, I felt it, like a second heartbeat. The contents of those pages had etched themselves into my skin, and no matter how tightly I folded the paper, the stories inside refused to stay quiet. They wanted out. They wanted someone to finally say aloud what had only been whispered in ink. I spent the weekend in a strange fog. I couldn't laugh at the comedy show playing in the background. I couldn't taste the food I made. I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be fully present. All I could think about were the names, the words, the haunting phrase at the bottom of that final page, "Don't let them say it never happened." The responsibility terrified me. I was a caregiver, not an investigator, not a journalist, not even a fluent English speaker half the time I needed to be. What could I do with this? Who would believe me? I didn't have documents or proof beyond what he had written. And yet, deep in my gut, I knew the truth when I saw it. This was no fantasy. This was the raw residue of history, and it had landed in my hands because no one else had stopped long enough to listen. I considered going to the administration. But what would I say? One of the patients gave me a decades-old letter about war crimes. They'd probably write it off as dementia. Or worse, accuse me of tampering. I thought about calling a hotline or reporting it anonymously, but I hesitated. Something inside told me the time wasn't right. Not yet. Not before I understood more. So I chose the only path I could live with. I decided to stay close, observe, watch. And when the time came, when Howard was ready, I'd be the one to receive the whole truth. Not just the written fragments, the real story, from his own lips if he still had the strength. Each day that week, I spent more time in room 112. At first, it was subtle, bringing his tea instead of the dietary aid, straightening his sheets more slowly, letting the silence stretch longer. His eyes followed me, not in suspicion, in assessment, like he was measuring something behind my eyes. Trust, maybe. Or fear. One morning, I found him awake before sunrise. The window blinds had been cracked open just enough to let a sliver of golden light touch the floor. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were wet. Not from tears. They weren't falling. They were just there, stuck, like his body had forgotten how to weep, but not how to ache. I sat beside him and didn't speak. I let the light fill the silence between us. After several minutes, he rasped something low. It was barely audible. I leaned in. "They never screamed," he said. The words landed in my stomach like a stone. I froze. Then I whispered back, "Who?" He didn't answer. He just closed his eyes. I thought about those words all day. I thought about the kind of pain that came from memory. Not of what you heard, but what you didn't. The silence of the dead. The guilt of surviving it. That night, I read the letters again, one by one. I began writing things down, making timelines, looking up names and coordinates. I cross-referenced the names he had written with old military records I found online. Some were there, others were missing, redacted. But the patterns were real. Places matched, dates lined up. I was slowly untangling something that had been deliberately buried. Still, I needed to know more. Who was Elaine? Who was Meredith? I took a risk and went to the facility's records room. It wasn't well protected, just a metal file cabinet near the nurse's station. I waited until the shift changed and slipped in quietly. Howard's file was thin. One photocopied ID, one medical report. But at the very back, Tucked between pages, there was a single intake form from the previous facility he had transferred from. Previous residence, Shady Pines Veterans Home, Roanoke, VA. Emergency contact, Elaine Livingston, deceased. Next of kin, Meredith Livingston, last known address redacted. I stared at the form until the letters blurred. She had been listed. At some point, he had admitted her existence. But now she was a ghost in the system. Redacted. Forgotten. That night, I took another risk. I messaged a friend of mine who worked in social services. I didn't give names. I just asked if it was possible to track down someone from an old veterans home file. Maybe, he said. Depends on how long ago. Depends who's asking. I didn't push further. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But I saved the file and kept it with the letters. When I returned to work the next morning, something had changed. Howard was sitting upright in bed. Not fully, just enough to notice. His head turned when I entered. His mouth opened slightly, and his voice, raw like gravel, came out again. Did you find her? The question caught me so off guard I forgot to breathe. Your daughter? I asked gently. He nodded. Slow. Deliberate. I'm trying, I said. He closed his eyes, but his lips kept moving. I never told her. About anything. She was just a child. I told her I had to serve. But I didn't say where. I didn't say what I did when I got back. Do you want her to know? I asked. He opened his eyes. There was something terrifying in them. Not directed at me, but at himself. She won't forgive me. She shouldn't. But I don't want to be erased. I want someone to say I existed. I want someone to remember that I was a father, even if I failed. I didn't know what to say. My throat was tight. My eyes burned. I wanted to say he still mattered, that the act of remembering was enough, but I wasn't sure I believed that. So instead, I sat beside him, and I said the only thing I truly believed. I see you. He nodded, barely. Then, with effort, he reached for something under his pillow. It was another envelope. This one smaller, thicker paper. A stamp that had never been used. For her, he said. I took it carefully. She'll want to tear it up, he added. Let her. And with that, he turned away and closed his eyes. The envelope trembled in my hand. Not because of its weight, but because it felt like I was holding the last piece of a man who had already begun to disappear. A goodbye he had spent a lifetime preparing for. The truth no longer needed to be hidden. But what I would do with it, I still didn't know. I kept the envelope sealed for 2 days. It sat on my kitchen table, untouched, surrounded by the clutter of my daily life. A chipped mug half full of cold coffee, a grocery list written on the back of a utility bill, my cracked phone screen glowing with unread notifications. But all of it faded beside that single envelope, so small and fragile, yet louder than anything else around me. I didn't open it. It wasn't mine to read. It belonged to someone who had lived decades without answers, without closure, without truth. Someone whose childhood had been molded around a man who was only half real, half father, half ghost. Someone who had waited, or maybe stopped waiting, for a truth that never came. Until now. But how do you deliver a letter like that? How do you look a grown woman in the eyes and hand her the final breath of a man who raised her and betrayed her at the same time? I didn't have her address. The facility's intake form only gave a redacted line. But I remembered the city. Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't far. 2 hours by bus. I took a chance and searched public records. The name Meredith Livingston wasn't common, but there were enough entries to make my stomach twist. I cross-referenced ages, voter registrations, real estate listings. Finally, I found her. Or at least someone who matched. Meredith L. Hawthorne. Age 64. Retired schoolteacher. Widowed. Her maiden name was Livingston. The next morning, I called in sick. I packed the envelope in a zippered pouch inside my purse, put on my most neutral sweater, and took the early Greyhound out of Raleigh. The ride was quiet. My hands didn't stop sweating. I rehearsed every version of the conversation I might have. I imagined tears, screaming, doors slammed in my face. But I also imagined silence, just the kind that follows when someone's entire understanding of their life is quietly rewritten. When I arrived in Asheville, I took a cab to the address listed, a modest brick house with a small porch and wind chimes that clinked gently in the breeze. The garden was well kept, hydrangeas and lavender. Someone here still cared about beauty. I stood at the gate for a long time, the letter a weight against my hip. I considered turning back, maybe mailing it instead, maybe leaving it in the mailbox, but none of that felt right. Howard had looked me in the eyes when he handed it to me. His voice, raspy and broken, had carried the weight of 60 years. If I was going to honor that, I needed to look her in the eyes, too. I walked up the path slowly and knocked. Footsteps, then silence. The door opened halfway. A woman appeared, white hair in a tight bun, loose cardigan, soft eyes that narrowed slightly when she saw me. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. "Are you Meredith Livingston?" I asked gently. Her posture stiffened, as if the name pulled something buried loose from her chest. "I was," she said. "A long time ago." "I think I have something that belongs to you," I said. My voice shook. She glanced at the envelope in my hand. She didn't reach for it. Her eyes darkened. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara. I work at a care facility in Raleigh. One of our patients, his name is Howard Livingston." Her hand went to the doorframe, to steady herself, or maybe to keep herself from running. "I don't want anything from him," she said quickly. "Whatever it is, I don't want it." "I understand," I replied. "I didn't come to change your mind. He just asked me to bring this." I extended the envelope, slowly, like handing someone a newborn made of glass. She stared at it. Her face cracked, not into tears, but into memory. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, she took it, with both hands. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at me, not as a stranger, not anymore. "Did he write it?" she asked. "Yes." "Did he look sorry?" "Yes." "Did he say my name?" "More than once." She closed her eyes. A tear didn't fall, but her mouth trembled. "I thought he was dead," she whispered. "He's dying," I said quietly. She nodded. "Same thing." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. I was stunned, but I nodded. The house smelled like lemon oil and old books. It was warm, lived in. A photo of 2 boys on the mantel, grandchildren maybe. A faded wedding picture beside it, but no sign of Howard. No childhood photos. No trace of a father. She poured chamomile into 2 mugs and sat across from me at a round kitchen table. We didn't speak for a while. She held the letter in her lap, unopened. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope as if memorizing its shape. "I used to wait by the window every Saturday morning," she said suddenly. "From the time I was 6 until I turned 10. I believed he'd walk back through the door, say it was a mistake, and sit down for pancakes. I believed that every week, and every week, he didn't come." I listened. "When I was 11, my mom told me he was overseas, that he was a hero, but I saw her cry at night. I knew something was wrong. When I turned 14, she sat me down and said, 'Your father is not who you think he is,' and she never said anything more." I nodded, letting her voice fill the room. "She died when I was 20, and that was it. No more stories, no more explanations, just silence. I didn't know if he was alive or dead. I got married, had kids. I told myself he was probably buried somewhere far away. I preferred that. I think he did too," I said gently. She looked at the letter again. Finally, she opened it. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes scanned slowly. I watched her face move through disbelief, sorrow, then something heavier. Not forgiveness, not anger. Something more complicated. A kind of mourning for a man she never knew, and for the girl who had once waited at a window. When she finished, she folded the letter and set it on the table. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked. "I do." She nodded again, then wiped her eyes once, quickly. "I won't write back," she said. "I don't think he expected you to." We sat in silence again. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "Thank you for bringing this," she said. "I don't know what I'll do with it, but at least I don't have to wonder anymore." I stepped out into the soft afternoon light. The air felt lighter. Not for me, but for her, and maybe, in some way, for him too. I didn't look back as I walked down the path. Some stories don't need closure, just release. When I returned to the facility, the building looked smaller, duller. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a familiar fatigue, and the nurses' voices blended into the background like static. I walked through the halls with a strange sense of distance, like I was seeing everything from underwater. The smell of antiseptic was stronger that day, or maybe it was just my senses, raw from what I had carried. Room 112 was exactly as I had left it. The blinds were still closed, the air still cold, but there was something different, something fragile. Howard was lying still, his chest rising in shallow waves. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. I could feel it. His face was pale, more than usual. The skin around his eyes had taken on a bluish tint, and his lips were cracked and dry. I stood there for a long moment, watching him breathe. "I gave it to her," I said softly. He didn't open his eyes, but his fingers moved, barely. A flicker, enough for me to know he heard. She didn't read it right away, but she did read it, and she didn't tear it up. His hand twitched again, this time curling inward slightly, like holding something invisible. "She said she used to wait for you, by the window, every Saturday morning." A tear formed at the corner of his closed eye. "I think she stopped waiting a long time ago," I whispered. "But now she knows." I sat in the chair beside his bed and rested my hand lightly over his. His skin was cold, too cold. "You're not invisible anymore, Howard. You didn't disappear." He didn't speak. I wasn't sure if he could anymore. But in that silence, something settled between us. A kind of peace. A quiet that wasn't heavy, but whole. I stayed with him for hours. I changed his sheets, cleaned his mouth with a damp sponge, and brushed his thinning hair back from his forehead. The other staff passed by the room, peeking in, but they didn't interrupt. They saw the way I was sitting there, like a daughter might sit, and they left us alone. As evening approached, I stood to stretch. That's when I noticed something on the floor beneath the dresser. A small piece of cardboard, half tucked under the leg of the furniture. I knelt down and pulled it free. It was another photo. This one was different. Color, though faded. A group of soldiers in a jungle. Mud-covered boots, sweat-soaked uniforms, rifles slung across their shoulders. And there, near the center, younger but unmistakable, was Howard. His jaw clenched, his eyes hard. There was something defiant in his stance, like he already knew what would come next. On the back of the photo, written in block letters, "Cambodia, 71, Operation Glass Veil." I sat back on my heels, photo in hand, heart racing again. I had never heard of Operation Glass Veil, but now I had a name, a location, a thread. I looked over at Howard. His breathing was slower now, more labored. "Was this it?" I asked, showing him the photo. "Is this where it happened?" His eyes opened slightly. They didn't focus well, but they found me, and they blinked. Once. The weight of it came crashing down again. Cambodia. The war behind the war. The places people weren't supposed to be. The missions buried deeper than any grave. I held the photo like evidence, like a key. Part of me wanted to take it straight to the press. Another part knew I had no idea what I was holding. Instead, I put it gently on his nightstand, beside the photo of Elaine and Meredith. Two pieces of a story that had never belonged in the same room, yet somehow fit perfectly together now. Later that night, after the rounds were done and the halls had grown quiet, I came back with a blanket and a book. I wasn't reading to him. Not really. But I needed to fill the room with something besides the sound of machines. I read out loud from an old collection of poetry I'd brought from home. His eyes stayed closed, but his fingers twitched at the rhythm of the words. When I paused, I spoke softly. "You were more than what you did. I don't know if anyone ever told you that, but you were. You are." There was no reply. Just breath. Just presence. Hours passed like this. At one point, the silence grew so deep I thought he had slipped away. But when I touched his wrist, the pulse was still there. Faint. Fragile. But there. I thought about Meredith. About her steady hands and her refusal to cry. I thought about what it must have taken for her to keep living after being left with silence. And I thought about the courage it had taken Howard to finally speak, even if only through trembling handwriting and a second-hand messenger. I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook I had started at home. It was filled with notes, timelines, sketches of memories that weren't mine. I had written down everything I'd learned, everything he had shared, everything I suspected. At first, it had been for myself, a way to cope, to understand. But now, I realized, it wasn't mine to keep. I placed the notebook on the windowsill, next to the unopened water cup and the daily meal he never touched. It didn't feel like much, but it felt like something. A record, a memory, a witness. The kind of thing people leave behind when they're finally ready to stop carrying it alone. By the time I looked back at Howard, his eyes were closed again, but his lips were parted slightly, and I saw the faintest curve of his mouth. Not a smile, but maybe something close to relief. The next morning, I arrived early. Earlier than I ever had before. The streets were still dark, the sky a deep bruised gray, the kind that only comes before dawn or after something terrible has passed. I didn't even clock in right away. I went straight to room 112, bypassing the front desk and the shift change chatter. My shoes barely made a sound down the corridor, like even the floor understood the weight of what was coming. Howard was still there, alive, but just barely. The machines no longer beeped with urgency. They whispered, slow and steady, the kind of rhythm that sounded more like counting down than keeping alive. The oxygen tube was still in place, but his breaths came in shallow gulps, spaced too far apart. His chest lifted in small, tired waves, like each breath was a negotiation with his body. I stood at the foot of his bed for a long time, just watching. The photo of the soldiers was still where I had left it. Beside it, the picture of Elaine and Meredith. And the notebook, mine, full of scribbles and timelines and questions I hadn't yet dared to ask aloud. I didn't touch anything. I sat down beside him and placed my hand gently over his. It was cold now. Not ice cold, not lifeless, but getting there. His skin felt papery, stretched thin over the bones. So thin, like if I pressed too hard, I'd tear right through the past. I whispered his name. He didn't respond, but his eyelids fluttered, almost like he was dreaming. I didn't know if he could still hear me, but I spoke anyway. I found something else, Howard. My voice was low, uncertain. Last night, after I got home, I searched for Operation Glass Veil. Most of it's gone, erased, sanitized. But I found pieces. There are people out there asking the same questions. A few journalists, some veterans. They don't have names, not yet, but they're looking. Just like you wanted. I paused. They're still covering it up, still pretending it didn't happen. But your story, it's a key. Maybe the first real one. A soft sound escaped his throat, barely audible. A breath, a moan, or maybe the last attempt at a word. I leaned closer. I'm going to share it, I whispered. Not all at once, not carelessly, but someone will know. Someone will hear you. I promise. He didn't move again, but I saw something change in his face. The lines around his eyes relaxed, his mouth unclenched. That weight, whatever part of it was still holding on, seemed to release. I reached into my bag and pulled out a fresh handkerchief, the one I always carried but never used. I gently dabbed his forehead, smoothed his hair back, and adjusted the blankets around him like I had 100 times before. But this time, it felt different, sacred, the way a person might prepare someone for their final journey. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, occasionally speaking, sometimes reading aloud, other times just sitting in silence so deep it felt like even time itself was holding its breath. Then quietly, something shifted. His chest stopped moving. The machine didn't alarm. It just stopped. No fanfare, no dramatic gasp, no final words. Just stillness. Complete. Peaceful. Final. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat there, holding his hand, memorizing the weight of it before it changed, memorizing the sound of the room before it turned into memory, memorizing the exact color of light slipping in through the blinds. Then I pressed the call button, stood up, and closed his eyelids gently with the tips of my fingers. The nurse on duty entered seconds later. She paused at the door, reading the silence like a diagnosis. "He's gone," I said softly. She nodded and stepped out to make the call. They would come soon. The attendants, the transport team, the clipboard woman who always asked if there were any personal effects to log. But I stayed. I owed him that much. When the orderlies arrived, I watched as they lifted him carefully, as if he might still feel pain. They wrapped him in white sheets, tucked neatly, and placed him on the stretcher. I walked alongside them to the doors, the ones that led to the back parking lot where the unmarked van always waited. They loaded him inside. No one else was there. No family, no ceremony. Just me. And silence. After they drove off, I returned to his room. It was already being prepped for cleaning, stripped of identity. The photos were gone. The bed was bare. The nameplate had been removed. I asked the nurse where the belongings were sent. She pointed to a box in the admin office. Inside were 3 items: the soldier photo, the family photo, and my notebook. I took the notebook. The rest I kept in my locker. That evening, as I sat on the bus home, the city lights flickering past the windows, I thought about how many lives Howard must have touched without anyone ever really seeing him, how many rooms he had sat in, silent, while the world kept spinning, how many nights he had rehearsed his confession, only to swallow it again and again. But in the end, he wasn't forgotten. He was heard, and maybe that was all he ever wanted. To be heard, to be remembered, not as a hero, not even as a man seeking redemption, just as someone who lived through something too big for words, and finally found the courage to speak. Grief didn't hit me like a tidal wave. It seeped in like fog. In the days following Howard's death, everything continued as if nothing had happened. The staff laughed at inside jokes. The smell of coffee mixed with disinfectant still wafted through the halls. New patients came in. Beds were changed. Buzzers were pressed and answered. But something in me had shifted. Something deep and quiet. I had carried his story, watched it unravel, and now he was gone. But he hadn't disappeared. I felt him everywhere. In the silence of the linen room, in the slow turn of a wheelchair in the hallway, in the hesitation between a question and its answer. His presence wasn't haunting. It was tethering, a reminder that stories once spoken never truly die. They live in the air, in the way we see the world after hearing them. One afternoon, after my shift ended, I walked to the nearby library. Not for books, but for records. I had made a promise to share his truth, but I didn't want to do it recklessly. I wanted to understand it fully. I wanted to be sure I wasn't carrying a lie wrapped in the skin of honesty. So I searched deeper into the fragments Howard had left behind. Operation Glass Veil, Cambodia, 1971. The deeper I went, the darker it got. There were redacted documents, pages where entire paragraphs had been blacked out, testimonies that ended abruptly, names that no longer existed in military archives. But between the lines, I started to piece together a map, not just of the operation, but of the cover-up. Civilians mistaken for hostiles, villages erased, orders that contradicted orders, and an entire unit discharged quietly, with medals and sealed mouths. One article led me to a journalist named Leo Bennett, a man who had spent the last 20 years investigating declassified military operations. He had written a piece in 2009 about a similar mission. Different name, different continent, same silencing. I found his email at the bottom of the article. I stared at the address for hours before I finally sent a message. I didn't say much, just that I had something he needed to see, that I wasn't looking for money or fame, just justice for someone who had carried too much, for too long. He replied within 24 hours, 3 words: "I'm listening. Call." I did. His voice was older than I expected, gravelly but sharp. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked questions fast: who I was, where I worked, what I had. I told him about Howard, about the letters, about the photos, about Meredith. He didn't interrupt, just listened. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You're not the first." That silence between us stretched. There was another man, from the same unit, different facility, died in '97, left behind journals, confessions. I tried publishing it, but the evidence was thin. They tore it apart. But your story, your documents, if they match, this could be it. I agreed to meet. 3 days later, we sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop 2 towns over. I brought the notebook, the photos, the envelope copies, everything I had. He read in silence, his hands trembling just slightly. When he finished, he leaned back and closed his eyes. Then, almost like a prayer, he whispered, "Finally." He spent the next week fact-checking, cross-referencing, calling old contacts. He contacted 2 retired officers who confirmed what they'd been too afraid to publish. The name Glass Veil had been whispered for decades, always in shadows. No one wanted it in the light, but the weight of time had loosened tongues. Then he made a decision. He was going to write it. Not just an article, a full exposé. A report backed by testimony, history, and humanity. He asked if I wanted to be named. I declined. I didn't want credit. I wanted Howard's voice to echo, not mine. A month later, the story went live. It was published online, then picked up by 2 major outlets. The title was simple: Operation Glass Veil, the truth one man took to his grave. The opening line broke me. He died in silence, but he didn't die unheard. The article exploded. Veterans reached out. Families of the lost demanded answers. Congressional aides sent inquiries. For the first time in decades, something buried was unearthing itself. But not everyone was pleased. The backlash came fast. Emails warning me to stop talking. Messages from blocked numbers. Anonymous voicemails telling me to leave the past where it belongs. Even the facility manager called me in, asked why reporters were calling, why that man's name was trending. I told the truth. Howard had given me something, and I gave it to someone who could carry it further. She stared at me for a long time, then sighed. I wish I hadn't asked. I wasn't fired, but I wasn't welcomed anymore either. Some staff stopped talking to me. Others whispered behind my back, but none of it mattered. Not really. Because for the first time, I felt clear. I wasn't lost in the fog anymore. I had followed a story that had led me to the edge of history and made me look over. And once you've seen what's down there, what people bury to keep breathing, you can't look away again. One evening, a package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a framed photo, the same one from Howard's nightstand, Elaine and Meredith. But this time someone had written on the back, in delicate cursive, "Thank you for giving me back my father." Even just a piece of him. No signature. Just that. I held it in my hands, heart pounding, and for the first time since Howard died, I let myself cry. Not from grief, but from gratitude. The first time I truly confronted Howard, it wasn't planned. It wasn't some heroic moment I'd imagined in my head. It was quiet, almost accidental. I had been standing at the nurse's station, updating charts, when I saw him sitting in the common area, the morning light filtering through the blinds, painting stripes across his frail frame. He wasn't lying in bed. He was upright, coffee cup in hand, staring at the floor. That was new. That was different. I walked over, my heart hammering, my hands clammy. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know if I would be able to say anything at all. "Mr. Livingston?" I started softly. "Can we talk for a moment?" He lifted his eyes slowly, pale, distant, but sharp, a flicker of recognition, not relief, not fear, just awareness, like a man who had spent decades preparing for a moment that might never come. I took a seat across from him, close enough to reach out, not close enough to overstep. "Do you remember the letter you left?" I asked. "The one I found under the mattress?" He didn't respond. Not immediately. His fingers traced the edge of his cup, tapping lightly, like drumming out a rhythm only he could hear. Then he nodded once. Slow, measured. "I read it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Every word. And I need to hear it from you. What happened? Everything. No one else. Just you and me. The corners of his mouth twitched, not into a smile, but into something that resembled the act of trying to remember. His chest rose with a deep, shaky breath. Then, in a voice so raw and broken I barely recognized it as human, he began, "I made choices," he said. "Things I can't undo. Things I wish I could erase. I told myself it was for duty, for honor, for country. But it wasn't. Not entirely. There were moments when I knew I was wrong and I did it anyway. And I never spoke about it. Not to anyone. I buried it under medals, under paperwork, under silence." He paused and I sat, frozen, as if the words themselves were physical objects that could break my body. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said suddenly, voice cracking. "I didn't want my daughter to know. I wanted her to love me, to see me as a man she could trust. But the truth would have ruined everything she ever believed about me. So I buried it. And I walked away. I left her." I swallowed hard. My chest was tight. My throat felt lined with sand. There was so much history in those words, so much pain. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. I let him pour out decades of silence in the middle of the room. "I remember her waiting by the window," he continued. "Every Saturday morning, rain or shine. I didn't come. I couldn't. I thought it was safer for her. That ignorance would be her shield. But I wasn't thinking about her happiness. I was thinking about my own guilt, my own shame." He lifted his hand, trembling, and pointed toward the floor as if the action itself could contain the weight of his confession. "I thought I could die without anyone knowing, without anyone remembering the man I was and the man I became." I reached out and lightly placed my hand over his. His skin was thin, fragile, but warm enough to remind me he was still here, still present, still human. "I see you," I said softly. "I hear you. All of it. Every word. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." A flicker crossed his face. Not happiness, not relief. Something harder to define. A shift. A surrender. A small crack in the armor he had built for decades. "I never asked for forgiveness," he whispered. "I didn't want it. But I need someone to know, to witness, to testify that I lived and I failed and I survived and I tried to make it right in the end." I nodded. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Witnessing was enough. Understanding was enough. Presence was enough. And then finally, he leaned back in his chair, eyes closing. His hand relaxed in mine, his body sinking slowly into the chair, the weight of confession finally lifting, if only a little. I stayed with him. Minutes passed. Hours felt like seconds. The room was quiet, except for the occasional distant clatter of the facility waking around us. But between us, there was a space that had never existed before. A space that was full of truth, full of history, full of raw humanity. "I don't know if she will ever forgive me," he murmured, voice fading. "I don't know if anyone ever could. But someone will know. And that may be enough." I squeezed his hand gently. "It is enough," I said. "It will be enough. Because the story matters. You matter." He exhaled deeply, long and heavy, like someone releasing years of trapped air. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. His lips parted into a fraction of a smile, tiny, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind me that beneath all the guilt, the shame, the unspoken horrors, there was still a man there. A man who had made mistakes, but who had finally found a witness. We sat like that for a long time, not talking, not moving, just existing together in the fragile bubble of honesty. The weight of decades of silence had been lifted slightly, shared with someone who could carry it without judgment. For the first time in years, Howard wasn't alone. He had spoken. He had been seen. And in the fragile act of confession and presence, there was a kind of redemption, not the kind that absolves the past, not the kind that erases the mistakes, but the kind that allows a man to finally breathe, finally exist without the crushing weight of secrets pressing down on him. And as I looked at him there, fragile and human, I realized that sometimes the act of being truly seen, truly heard, is the closest thing we get to salvation. After the confrontation, the room felt lighter, though still heavy with years of unspoken truths. Howard's eyes, once distant and clouded, had a quiet focus now, as if the act of confessing had loosened some invisible weight. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was subtle, fragile, and entirely human. The lines of his face, deep with age and regret, seemed to soften, not because the past had changed, but because he had finally allowed someone to witness it. I continued visiting him daily. The mornings were quiet. I would bring tea, warm and fragrant, sometimes a small tray of oatmeal or fruit. I didn't speak much unless he did. He didn't need conversation. He needed presence, understanding, and a listener he could trust. Some days, he would whisper fragments of memories, names, places, and dates, and I would write them down. Other days, he simply sat with me, letting silence pass like a soft tide between us. One afternoon, he handed me another envelope. It was heavier than the others, lined with thick, yellowed paper. His hand trembled as he gave it to me, and for a moment, I thought he might not have the strength to release it. This is for her, he said, voice faint but deliberate. When I'm gone, she needs to hear it. I want her to know that I tried, that I existed, that I never stopped thinking of her. I nodded, swallowing hard. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down like the humidity of a summer night. I will give it to her, I whispered. I promise. He closed his eyes then, resting back against the pillow. His breathing slowed, and for the first time I could see him fully relax, as if finally letting go of a lifetime of tension. The days passed quietly after that. He began eating a little better, speaking a little more. There was a calmness in him, a subtle ease that hadn't existed before. I often sat beside him, holding his hand, watching him sleep, marveling at how fragile and resilient the human spirit could be. Then one morning, I arrived to find him already at the window, looking out over the small garden behind the facility. Sunlight spilled in across his lap. I entered quietly and stood for a moment, simply watching him. "You'll be leaving soon," I said softly. He nodded, not in acknowledgement of me, but of something deeper, something final. "I am ready," he murmured. "I've waited a long time." Later that week, he passed away quietly, surrounded by the soft hum of the machines and the gentle light of the morning sun. No dramatic collapse, no last words screamed into the emptiness, just stillness, peaceful, final, and full of the dignity he had carried so quietly through his life. I stayed with him until the transport arrived. His belongings were carefully packed, the photos of Elaine and Meredith, the letters, and my notebook filled with notes, memories, and observations. Everything he had left behind was preserved, a record of a life both burdened and extraordinary. When I finally delivered the envelope to Meredith, her reaction was unlike anything I had expected. She held the paper delicately as if it were glass. Her hands trembled, not with anger, not with fear, but with the weight of understanding. As she read, tears fell silently down her cheeks, and I could see the daughter she had been, waiting for a father who had carried the world inside him for decades. She didn't speak for a long time, but her eyes said everything: grief, forgiveness, shock, and finally, a kind of relief. "I cannot forgive everything," she whispered finally. "But I understand now, and that is more than I ever thought I would get." It was the closure they both needed in different ways. Howard, in his final days, had finally been seen. Meredith, after decades of uncertainty, had finally heard the truth. Sitting quietly in that small living room, I realized something profound. The world is full of silences, silent rooms, silent hearts, secrets buried under decades of routine and fear. And sometimes, it takes just one person willing to listen to give life back to the unheard. It takes courage, empathy, and patience. But even in the smallest gestures, listening, witnessing, acknowledging, a life can be redeemed, a story can be preserved, and a heart can finally rest. I left Meredith's house with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. I held the framed photos Howard had left behind, walking slowly, aware that the weight of his story was now part of my own. Some stories do not end neatly. They do not close like a book with a final page, but they continue in the quiet spaces between people, in memories shared, in voices carried forward. And Howard's story, once buried beneath decades of silence, was now alive. It would be remembered, it would be spoken of, and it would inspire compassion, courage, and the understanding that even the heaviest burdens can be eased when someone simply chooses to see, hear, and honor the truth. For Howard, for Meredith, for all the forgotten stories waiting to be told, and for everyone who has ever needed someone to simply listen, I am grateful to have been that witness, even for just a moment. Thank you for allowing me to share this story. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering. Stories like this remind us that empathy matters, that silence can be broken, and that every life, no matter how quiet or hidden, deserves to be acknowledged, honored, and remembered. Howard's story is not just his. It belongs to all of us, and I will carry it with me, always.